Geneva is calm tonight. The lake is still. The lights reflect off the water. Diplomats leave through quiet doors, but behind those doors, something just failed. After 6 intense hours of negotiations, some indirect, some face-to-face, the United States and Iran walked away without a deal. And when talks collapse in Geneva, history has a habit of shifting elsewhere. This was not just another diplomatic meeting. This was the third round of negotiations between Washington and Tehran over Iran's nuclear program. Talks that were supposed to stabilize one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world. Instead, they exposed how far apart the two sides remain. And in the background, something else is happening. The United States has assembled the largest concentration of air and naval power in the Middle East in more than 2 decades. Diplomacy is still alive, but deterrence is no longer subtle. The negotiations were held at the residence of the Omani ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. Oman has positioned itself as the quiet bridge between Washington and Tehran, trusted enough by both sides to relay messages that neither is willing to say directly. The talks unfolded in 2 formats. First, indirect negotiations, with Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, physically moving between rooms, carrying proposals and counter-proposals. Second, direct engagement, U.S. and Iranian negotiators sitting face-to-face, 6 hours, 2 formats, multiple drafts exchanged, and at the end of the day, no agreement. Both sides admitted there had been movement. But movement is not resolution. The core disputes remain exactly where they were when talks began earlier this month. The 5 fault lines. Behind the diplomatic language are 5 unresolved issues. Each one is a strategic fault line. 1. Uranium enrichment. Iran insists it has the sovereign right to enrich uranium. The United States insists enrichment must be limited or dismantled in a verifiable way. This is not a technical disagreement. It is existential. Because enrichment capacity equals breakout potential, and breakout potential equals leverage. 2. Stockpiled material. Iran has accumulated enriched uranium stockpiles that concern Western intelligence services. Washington wants that material reduced or transferred abroad. Tehran rejects the idea of shipping it out. Why? Because once stockpiles leave Iranian territory, leverage leaves with them. 3. Permanence. The U.S. wants an agreement that cannot be easily reversed. Iran wants flexibility, especially given that the original 2015 deal collapsed when Washington withdrew. From Tehran's perspective, why sign a permanent concession when U.S. political cycles can undo it? Trust is not just low, it is structurally broken. 4. Sanctions relief. For Iran, sanctions relief is the entire point. Its economy has been squeezed by restrictions on oil exports, banking access, and trade. Tehran wants immediate, tangible relief. Washington wants phased relief tied to compliance. This is a sequencing battle, and sequencing battles often kill agreements. 5. Ballistic missiles. The United States wants Iran's missile program included in any deal. Iran rejects that outright. From Tehran's perspective, missiles are conventional defense, not nuclear weapons. From Washington's perspective, missiles are delivery systems, and delivery systems without restrictions make enrichment limits meaningless. After the talks, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, struck a cautiously optimistic tone. He called it the most intense round yet. He spoke of mutual understanding. He said both sides had identified main elements of a possible agreement. But listen carefully to the phrasing. Possible agreement, general understanding. Differences remain. Diplomatic language often hides more than it reveals. He confirmed technical teams would meet in Vienna at the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That matters, because once technical teams get involved, discussions shift from political symbolism to engineering reality. And engineering reality is unforgiving. The International Atomic Energy Agency will ultimately be responsible for monitoring any deal. Its Director General, Rafael Grossi, was present in Geneva. That presence sends a signal, because verification is not political. It is mechanical. Cameras must be installed, sensors calibrated, access granted, reports filed. If verification mechanisms fail, the deal fails. Grossi's involvement suggests serious groundwork, but groundwork without agreement is just preparation. On Friday, I'm not thrilled. That language matters, because this administration entered negotiations hoping for speed. 3 rounds later, speed has become patience, and patience is thinning. Behind the words is something more powerful than rhetoric. The United States has deployed an extraordinary concentration of aircraft and warships to the region. This is not symbolic diplomacy. This is leverage, military leverage. Oman's foreign minister described significant progress. But just before talks ended, Iranian state television reported that Tehran would continue enriching uranium and rejected transferring material abroad. That contradiction tells you everything. Public messaging is calibrated differently for domestic audiences. Oman speaks of progress. Iranian state TV signals defiance. Washington signals impatience. Everyone is talking. No one is conceding. Before traveling to Geneva, Araghchi gave an interview with a stark warning. If diplomacy fails, he said, there would be no victory for anybody. He described a devastating regional war, and that is not exaggeration. U.S. bases are scattered across the Middle East, from the Gulf to the Eastern Mediterranean. Any escalation would not remain contained. It would trigger proxy networks, missile exchanges, energy infrastructure risks, global market shockwaves. This is not 2003. The region is more interconnected, more armed, more volatile. While diplomats debated language in Geneva, military planners studied maps, carrier groups positioned, air wings rotated, surveillance intensified. The concentration of U.S. power in the region is the largest in over 20 years. That fact alone changes negotiation dynamics. Diplomacy backed by force is called deterrence. Diplomacy overshadowed by force is called pressure. Which one this is depends on who you ask. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Both sides want talks to continue. Neither side wants war, but neither side wants to appear weak. Iran cannot politically accept dismantlement without sanctions relief. The U.S. cannot politically accept enrichment without permanent verification. So they move incrementally, statement by statement, round by round, hoping the other side blinks first. Behind every negotiation is a clock. Oil markets are watching. Regional allies are watching. Domestic audiences are watching. If talks drag without breakthrough, pressure increases. If talks collapse entirely, escalation risk multiplies. The window between diplomacy and confrontation is narrow, and history shows that narrow windows close quickly. So where does this leave us? Talks will continue. Technical teams will meet. Statements will be issued. Optimism will be expressed. But until one side shifts on enrichment, stockpiles, sanction sequencing, or missile inclusion, the gap remains, and that gap is dangerous. Because in geopolitics, stalemate is rarely stable. It either resolves or it ruptures. Geneva was supposed to reduce risk. Instead, it clarified it. The two sides can talk. They can meet. They can identify elements of agreement, but they are still negotiating from fundamentally incompatible strategic positions. The alternative, as Araghchi warned, would be devastating, not just for Iran, not just for the United States, but for an entire region already stretched thin. The lake in Geneva is calm tonight, but calm water does not mean calm currents. Sometimes it means pressure building beneath the surface, and when that pressure releases, it doesn't ask for permission. In every negotiation, there's a point where compromise ends and identity begins. In Geneva, that point has been reached. Behind the diplomatic language, behind the optimism, behind the promises of technical meetings in Vienna, there are two positions that cannot coexist. Iran says, we will never build a nuclear weapon. The United States says, prove it, permanently. And between those two sentences lies one of the most dangerous geopolitical gaps in the world. Very few details of Tehran's written proposal have been made public, but officials familiar with the discussions indicate Iran has put forward a framework built on three pillars. Dilute part of its 60% enriched uranium. Keep all nuclear material inside Iran. Pair nuclear steps with economic incentives for the United States. Let's break that down. Dilution means taking highly enriched uranium and reducing its concentration, effectively lowering its weapons proximity. From a public relations perspective, that sounds like compromise. But from Washington's perspective, dilution is reversible. Material diluted to lower enrichment can technically be reprocessed again, which means capability remains intact. The second pillar is even more critical. Nothing leaves Iran. No stockpiles shipped abroad. No surrender of enriched uranium. No physical removal of strategic leverage. Tehran insists its enriched material remains sovereign property. And then there is the economic dimension. Iran reportedly floated opportunities tied to oil, gas, and even aircraft purchases, signaling that a deal could open commercial pathways. It is a classic diplomatic formula, security concessions paired with economic normalization. But the security concession offered is limited, and that is the core problem. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi has been remarkably consistent. On CBS's Face the Nation, he said something that defines Tehran's position. Enrichment is our right, not preference, not privilege, right. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, member states are permitted peaceful nuclear energy development. Iran argues that enrichment for civilian energy purposes falls squarely within that legal framework. And on paper it does. But enrichment is what makes weapons capability possible. That is why Washington sees enrichment itself as the danger, regardless of stated intent. Araghchi framed Iran's position carefully. Iran will never build a nuclear weapon, but Iran will never surrender its right to enrichment. That dual message is politically powerful inside Iran. It reassures hardliners on sovereignty. It reassures moderates on nonproliferation, but for Washington, it is structurally unacceptable. Because enrichment capability, even if unused for weapons, keeps the breakout option alive. Now contrast that with the U.S. demands. According to multiple reports, Washington's position includes destruction of Iran's 3 major nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, transfer of all enriched uranium stockpiles to the United States, a permanent agreement with no sunset clauses, an end to uranium enrichment. That is not a modification. That is surrender of strategic capability. The difference between dilution and destruction is enormous. Dilution keeps infrastructure. Destruction removes it. The difference between temporary limits and permanent ones is equally massive. The original 2015 nuclear agreement included sunset clauses, meaning restrictions expired over time. The United States now wants permanence. Why? Because sunset clauses create a ticking clock. Permanent restrictions remove it. From Washington's perspective, this is about closing every path to a bomb, now and in the future. From Tehran's perspective, it is about stripping Iran of sovereign capability indefinitely, and that is a non-starter. One of the less discussed but strategically critical elements is Iran's stockpile, roughly 10,000 kilograms of enriched uranium. Washington wants it gone, delivered out, removed from Iranian control. Tehran says nothing leaves. Elias Hazrati, head of Iran's Government Information Council, was blunt. Enrichment will continue in accordance with needs, and nothing will leave Iran. That statement crystallizes the divide, because the U.S. cannot politically accept enrichment continuing, and Iran cannot politically accept exporting its nuclear material. It's not just policy, it's national pride. Sanctions relief is the mirror image of enrichment. Iran wants all U.S. sanctions lifted, and even United Nations Security Council resolutions terminated. The United States refuses to commit to that up front. Why? Because sanctions are leverage. Once lifted, leverage disappears. Iran argues that it already made concessions under the previous deal and saw Washington withdraw. From Tehran's perspective, why trust incremental relief? From Washington's perspective, why grant full relief before permanent verification? This is a sequencing war, and sequencing wars are often unwinnable. Next week, U.S. and Iranian technical teams will meet at the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. That location matters, because once discussions shift to engineers and inspectors, ambiguity shrinks. Technical teams do not debate ideology, they debate centrifuge counts, material volumes, verification mechanisms, inspection schedules. At that level, either the math works or it doesn't. The question is whether those technical talks produce creative compromise or simply formalize deadlock in greater detail. As if the nuclear file were not complex enough, there is a second fault line: ballistic missiles. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been explicit. Iran's missile program, particularly efforts toward longer-range systems, is deeply concerning. Washington sees missile capability as inseparable from nuclear potential. A warhead requires a delivery system. Iran refuses to include missiles in negotiations. Araghchi calls them defensive, deterrence tools, conventional weapons. And here's the key. Iran does not view missiles as negotiable. They are part of its regional deterrence strategy, especially given U.S. bases across the Middle East. From Tehran's perspective, missiles compensate for Air Force limitations. From Washington's perspective, missiles amplify nuclear risk. Rubio called Iran's refusal to discuss missiles a big problem. He's not wrong, because even if nuclear enrichment were resolved, missile capability keeps escalation potential alive. Strip away the rhetoric. What remains? Iran wants recognition of enrichment rights, stockpiles kept domestically, full sanctions relief, missile program excluded. The United States wants destruction of enrichment infrastructure, removal of stockpiles abroad, permanent restrictions, missile constraints included. Those are not small differences. They are foundational contradictions. One side seeks sovereign capability with safeguards. The other seeks irreversible dismantlement. There's almost no overlap. This is not just about Geneva. It is about regional stability, S forces remain deployed across the Gulf. Allies like Israel are watching closely. Energy markets are sensitive. If diplomacy collapses completely, the risk escalates rapidly. Araghchi warned of devastating regional war. That warning was not theatrical. Any military confrontation would likely expand beyond bilateral exchange. Proxy networks, regional militias, maritime choke points, energy infrastructure. The costs would not be contained. Here's the paradox. Iran says it will never build a nuclear weapon. The United States says it believes Iran might. Iran says enrichment is peaceful. The United States says enrichment is potential. Both positions are internally logical. Both are politically rigid. That is why the talks move forward, yet remain stuck. The technical teams will meet in Vienna. Statements will follow. Optimism will be cautiously expressed. But unless one side redefines its red line, the core structure remains incompatible. Can a deal exist that allows enrichment without breakout risk? Can sanctions relief be permanent without political reversal? Can missiles remain untouched while nuclear constraints hold? Those are not procedural questions. They are structural ones. And structural questions do not bend easily. Diplomacy thrives on ambiguity, but physics does not. Centrifuges either spin or they don't. Uranium either remains or it leaves. Missiles either fall under negotiation or they don't. Geneva has clarified the battlefield. The next round in Vienna will test whether creative diplomacy can bridge sovereign pride and strategic fear. If it cannot, the conversation shifts from negotiation rooms to deterrence postures. And history shows that when diplomacy narrows, risk expands. Geneva was supposed to cool tensions. Instead, it clarified them. The talks between the United States and Iran are no longer just about uranium. They are about missiles, about militias, about power projection, about who defines security in the Middle East. And increasingly, they are about time. Because while diplomats talk in Switzerland, aircraft carriers move in silence. At first, this negotiation was framed as nuclear: limit enrichment, reduce stockpiles, restore inspections. But Washington's position has widened. The United States is now pressing Iran not only on uranium enrichment, but also on its long-range missile program, its support for armed groups across the Middle East. From Washington's perspective, these issues are inseparable. A nuclear-capable state with long-range missiles and a network of regional armed allies represents a structural threat. From Tehran's perspective, this expansion of scope is unacceptable. Iran has made its position clear. It will discuss nuclear issues, nothing else. Its missile program is defensive. Its regional relationships are sovereign foreign policy decisions. That is not a minor disagreement. That is a clash over what the negotiation is even about. The United States wants Iran to reduce or end support for militant groups operating in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Iran rejects that demand outright, because those networks are not temporary alliances. They are pillars of Iran's regional deterrence doctrine. Tehran's strategy has long relied on asymmetric leverage, influence without direct confrontation. For Washington, that is destabilization. For Tehran, that is survival. So when the U.S. says roll back proxies, Iran hears surrender your regional deterrent. That is why this issue has become a deadlock multiplier. Reporting from Tehran, Al Jazeera's Tawhid Asadi summarized the situation with brutal clarity. The bottom line is gaps obviously exist. If anything is certain, that is uncertainty. That line captures the entire negotiation. Both sides keep meeting. Both sides signal seriousness. But the structural gaps are not narrowing fast enough, and time is not neutral. Time increases pressure. On the American side, the talks are led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. On the Iranian side, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi continues his patient shuttle diplomacy, moving between rooms, relaying messages, hosting pre-talks meetings. The diplomatic backstage has expanded beyond Geneva. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Larijani met with Qatar's emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Regional capitals are engaged, because everyone understands if these talks fail, consequences will not remain confined to Iran and the U.S. There's also domestic pressure. Some U.S. lawmakers have questioned whether Witkoff and Kushner, who are also engaged in other high-stakes diplomatic tracks, can effectively manage the workload. Senator Tom Tillis publicly called it suspect. That the same two people are handling multiple global negotiations, that criticism matters, because if talks fail, blame will be assigned, and political vulnerability narrows diplomatic flexibility. Before the latest round of talks, Witkoff gave an interview stating that Iran was probably a week away from having industrial-grade bomb-making material. That assessment was more alarming than other public statements from U.S. officials. It injected urgency. It shifted the tone. If true, that compresses diplomatic timelines dramatically, because once a state reaches industrial-grade capability, the breakout calculation changes. Whether that assessment is strategic messaging or intelligence-based urgency, it raises the stakes. And then there's the military buildup. It is visible. It is deliberate. It is not subtle. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been stationed in the Arabian Sea since late January. Then came the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, along with destroyers and thousands of additional personnel. Dozens of fighter jets, F-35s, F-22s, F-15s, F-16s, have been tracked flying into the region. Some aircraft were parked openly at civilian airports in Israel and Crete. That visibility is intentional. It is deterrence as theater. It is leverage made physical. On social media, President Trump declared that a massive armada was heading toward Iran. He warned that if no deal were reached, the next attack will be far worse. That is not background noise. That is escalation signaling. Senior national security officials have reportedly reviewed options including airstrikes, cyber operations, targeted raids. Those discussions do not mean action is imminent, but they mean planning is active. One anonymous advisor reportedly estimated a 90% chance of kinetic action within weeks. Such statements may be exaggeration, but they reflect internal impatience. And impatience in geopolitics is dangerous, U.S. Central Command has framed the buildup as defensive, a show of strength, a means of protecting U.S. forces. Deterrence comes through a show of strength, said a CENTCOM spokesman. This is classic doctrine. Make capability visible, signal readiness, hope the other side recalculates. But deterrence has a paradox. The stronger the show of force, the more the opponent must respond symbolically to avoid appearing weak. That creates a feedback loop. From Tehran's perspective, the military buildup confirms suspicion. It reinforces the belief that Washington negotiates from coercion, which hardens Iran's stance. If Iran were to concede too much under visible military pressure, it would look like surrender, and that is politically impossible domestically. So instead, Iran reiterates, enrichment is our right, missiles are defensive, proxies are sovereign policy. Sanctions must be lifted. The more visible the armada becomes, the less flexible Iran can appear. Al Jazeera's Kimberly Halkett described the U.S. approach clearly. Build leverage through force and sanctions, then extract concessions. The hope is limit enrichment now, address missiles and proxies later. In exchange, provide economic relief. But that sequencing assumes Iran trusts the second phase will happen. Tehran does not trust that. It remembers the previous deal. It remembers sanctions snapping back. Trust deficit is the silent player in this negotiation. If diplomacy stalls completely, what happens? First, intensified sanctions. Second, cyber pressure. Third, maritime enforcement. Only later would overt military strikes become likely. But once the ladder is climbed, climbing down is harder, and every visible aircraft carrier narrows ambiguity. Strip away the headlines. This negotiation is not just about centrifuges. It is about regional power balance, missile deterrence, proxy influence, economic survival. Political credibility. The United States wants comprehensive rollback. Iran wants limited nuclear compromise without surrendering strategic depth. Those positions overlap minimally. Right now, diplomacy is still active. Technical teams will meet. Back-channel communication continues. Oman keeps mediating. Regional actors keep watching. But the military buildup has changed the atmosphere. It has compressed patience. It has amplified stakes. It has made failure more consequential. Can diplomacy survive visible preparation for war? Can enrichment limits be separated from missiles and proxies? Can sanctions relief be trusted? Or are both sides approaching a point where neither can politically retreat? Geneva did not produce collapse, but it did not produce convergence. And in geopolitics, prolonged deadlock under rising military pressure is unstable. There are moments in history when negotiations fail quietly. And there are moments when negotiations continue, and while war preparations advance in parallel. This is the second kind. The armada is visible. The red lines are firm. The rhetoric is sharpening. The uncertainty is real. If diplomacy succeeds, it will be because both sides recalculated at the last moment. If it fails, historians may look back at Geneva and say, the warning signs were already there. Diplomacy did not collapse in Geneva, but something else intensified: the language. In Washington, the tone shifted from negotiation to accusation. Vice President J.D. Vance stood at the White House podium and made a statement that changed the atmosphere entirely. Iran, he said, was attempting to rebuild its nuclear program after U.S. strikes last June, and then he made the principle explicit. Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. If they try to rebuild, that causes problems for us. That is not diplomacy, that is a red line. President Donald Trump, in his State of the Union address, went further. He repeated his claim that U.S. strikes had obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program last summer. But the International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's nuclear watchdog, has cast doubt on that characterization. That contradiction matters, because if the program was truly obliterated, rebuilding would take years. If it was only degraded, rebuilding could be far faster. And here lies the problem. Since the strikes, IAEA inspectors have been unable to visit Iranian nuclear sites. No inspections, no verification, no independent confirmation. That vacuum feeds distrust on both sides. Washington says Iran is rebuilding. Tehran says it is not. The IAEA cannot currently confirm either claim. In geopolitics, uncertainty is combustible. Satellite images from late January showed new roofs constructed over damaged sections of facilities in Natanz and Isfahan. Roofs can mean repair. Roofs can mean containment. Roofs can mean reconstruction. Or they can mean nothing significant at all. Without inspectors on the ground, interpretation becomes political. And when intelligence becomes political, escalation risk rises. Then came a question posed to Vice President Vance. Could he have foreseen being part of an administration entertaining regime change in Iran? His answer was indirect but not dismissive. Life has all kinds of crazy twists and turns. That single remark widened the psychological battlefield, because regime change rhetoric transforms negotiation into existential confrontation. If Tehran believes Washington's long-term objective is not behavior change, but government change, then concessions become dangerous. Concessions would look like weakness. And weakness invites pressure. That perception hardens positions. Trump also claimed Iran was working to develop missiles capable of reaching the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio offered a slightly more cautious tone, saying Iran was not currently enriching uranium, but was trying to rebuild elements of its program. Notice the subtle gap. Not enriching, but rebuilding. That nuance creates ambiguity. Ambiguity creates urgency. Urgency compresses diplomacy. Tehran's reaction was immediate. The Iranian Foreign Ministry accused Trump of repeating big lies. They dismissed the nuclear weapon allegation outright. They compared Washington's messaging strategy to historical propaganda techniques. The language was sharp, emotional, defiant. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian invoked the supreme leader's prior religious decree against nuclear weapons, arguing that a religious leader cannot issue a prohibition and secretly violate it. That argument is powerful domestically. It frames nuclear restraint as moral doctrine, not just political choice. But in Washington, religious decrees are not considered verification mechanisms. Trust is measured in inspections, not intentions. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf delivered a calibrated warning. If diplomacy respects Iran's dignity, Iran will sit at the table. If deception or attack occurs during negotiations, the response will be severe. The parliament formally declared readiness for defense that would make any aggressor regret its actions. That phrasing is strategic. It signals preparedness without initiating escalation. But then Araghchi went further. Araghchi made something clear on the eve of talks. If the U.S. attacks, Iran will respond, and because Iran's missiles cannot reach American soil directly, the response would target U.S. bases in the region. That is a critical strategic statement. It shifts the battlefield geography. The U.S. homeland is distant, but U.S. forces in the Middle East are not. Tens of thousands of troops are stationed across the region. Air bases, naval facilities, logistics hubs. In the event of conflict, those would be immediate targets. Tehran has also reiterated a long-standing threat: closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway carries a significant portion of global oil shipments. Even temporary disruption would shock energy markets worldwide. This is not a bilateral risk. It is a global one. While threats escalate publicly, financial pressure escalates quietly. On the eve of Geneva talks, the U.S. Treasury announced sanctions against more than 30 individuals, entities, and vessels. The accusations included financing illicit oil sales, supporting missile development, procuring weapons components, funding proxy groups. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent accused Iran of exploiting financial systems. The State Department framed the sanctions as a response to Iran prioritizing proxies over its own population. Tehran called the sanctions bad faith. And from a negotiation standpoint, timing matters. Imposing sanctions just before talks can be seen as leverage or provocation, depending on perspective. Right now, two realities coexist. Reality one, diplomats are preparing technical meetings in Vienna. Channels remain open. Statements about progress continue. Reality two, military deployments expand. Sanctions increase. Accusations sharpen. Regime change is whispered. Retaliation is openly described. These realities are not separate. They are interacting. Every new sanction influences negotiation tone. Every military deployment influences domestic politics. Every public accusation reduces room for compromise. This is no longer only about centrifuges. It is about credibility. If Trump claims Iran is rebuilding and inspectors cannot confirm otherwise, Washington must either act on that claim or risk appearing weak. If Iran insists it will never build a weapon but refuses intrusive inspections, it fuels suspicion. Both sides are trapped in a credibility contest, and credibility contests often escalate, because once a leader publicly commits to a line, retreat becomes costly. Let's pause here. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical energy choke points. A significant share of global oil flows through it daily. If conflict disrupts that passage, oil prices would spike instantly. Markets would react within minutes. Insurance premiums would skyrocket. Shipping routes would freeze. This is why global powers beyond the US and Iran are watching closely. This is not a regional matter. It is systemic. Perhaps the most dangerous element right now is not rhetoric. It is the absence of independent verification. IAEA inspectors have not had access since the strikes. Director General Rafael Grossi has insisted that access is essential. Without inspectors, Neither side can rely on neutral confirmation. Every claim becomes contested. Every denial becomes doubted. And in that vacuum, miscalculation thrives. So where does this leave us? The United States says Iran cannot rebuild. Iran cannot enrich toward weapons grade. Iran must take military threats seriously. Iran says it has no nuclear weapons ambitions. It will defend itself. It will respond to attack. It will not surrender enrichment or regional deterrence. Both sides insist they prefer diplomacy. Both sides are preparing for alternatives. History often pivots in moments like this. Accusations escalate. Military postures harden. Economic pressure intensifies. And diplomacy continues, but under strain. The question now is not whether talks will continue. They will. The question is whether they can produce trust faster than suspicion grows. Because suspicion is accelerating. And once suspicion outruns diplomacy, events move quickly. The accusation phase is dangerous, not because words are weapons, but because words commit leaders to paths. When a vice president says rebuilding causes problems, that is a promise. When a president says he will never allow a weapon, that is a commitment. When a foreign minister says retaliation will target regional bases, that is doctrine. These are not casual remarks. They are signals. And signals shape decisions. The inspectors are absent. The satellites see shadows. The sanctions tighten. The armada remains visible. Diplomacy still breathes. But it is breathing under pressure. The aircraft carriers are in position. Fighter jets are in the sky. Sanctions are tightening. And diplomats are sitting across from each other in carefully controlled rooms in Geneva. The question hanging over all of it is simple, but terrifying. Is the United States on the brink of war with Iran? Right now, the world is watching one of the most dangerous geopolitical standoffs in years unfold between Washington and Tehran. On the surface, negotiations are ongoing. But beneath that diplomatic language lies a buildup of military power so visible, so deliberate, that it cannot be mistaken for a routine positioning. This is not subtle diplomacy. This is pressure. At the center of the crisis is uranium enrichment. President Donald Trump has demanded that Iran completely halt its uranium enrichment program. Not pause it, not limit it, end it. But Tehran refuses. Iran insists its nuclear program is entirely peaceful and says it will only negotiate over nuclear issues, not its ballistic missile program, and not its support for armed groups across the Middle East. The Trump administration, however, wants more. Washington's position includes a full stop to uranium enrichment rollback of long-range missile development, an end to Iranian support for regional proxy forces. Iran's leadership has flatly rejected expanding talks beyond nuclear matters. As Al Jazeera's Tawhid Asadi reported from Tehran, the bottom line is clear: gaps remain. Diplomatic engagement may or may not lead to a solution. Until then, uncertainty dominates. The third round of talks was led on the American side by Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Iran's delegation was headed by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The first meeting took place in Oman on February 6th. The second followed in Geneva on February 17th. Now the third round carries immense pressure. Oman has quietly served as mediator throughout, with its foreign minister acting as go-between. Behind the scenes, Qatar has also played a role. Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Larijani met with Qatar's Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, signaling just how wide the diplomatic stage has become. After the second meeting, Araghchi said both sides had reached a tentative understanding on broad principles, but no actual agreement. That distinction matters. Broad principles do not stop wars. Hovering over every diplomatic conversation is the unmistakable presence of U.S. military force. The United States has assembled one of its largest Middle East deployments in decades. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group sits in the Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, has been ordered to the region with thousands of additional personnel. Dozens of fighter jets, F-35s, F-22s, F-15s, and F-16s, have been tracked heading toward Middle Eastern bases. Refueling aircraft and A-10 ground attack planes have been parked in plain sight. This visibility is intentional. The message is not whispered. It is broadcast. President Trump reinforced it on Truth Social, declaring that a massive armada is heading to Iran, and warning that if Iran does not agree to a deal, the next attack would be far worse. Senior U.S. national security officials have reviewed military options, including airstrikes, cyber operations, targeted commando raids. One anonymous advisor reportedly said there was a 90% chance of kinetic action within weeks. This is not diplomatic theater. This is coercive diplomacy backed by force. In Washington, Vice President J.D. Vance accused Iran of attempting to rebuild its nuclear program after U.S. strikes last June. The principle is very simple, Vance said. Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. He emphasized that diplomacy is preferred, but military options remain. Trump echoed similar language during his State of the Union address, claiming U.S. strikes had obliterated Iran's nuclear program. But that claim is disputed. The International Atomic Energy Agency has not verified the destruction. Inspectors have not been allowed back into key sites like Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Satellite images show reconstruction activity, but what exactly is happening remains unknown. That uncertainty fuels mistrust on both sides. Tehran has responded sharply. Iran's foreign ministry accused Trump of repeating big lies. Officials rejected accusations that they are rebuilding nuclear weapons capabilities and criticized what they called propaganda tactics. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, reiterated that the supreme leader has declared nuclear weapons forbidden. But alongside diplomatic language came a clear warning. Foreign Minister Araghchi stated plainly, if the U.S. attacks, Iran will respond. While Iranian missiles cannot reach American soil, he warned they could strike U.S. bases across the region. Tehran has also threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant portion of global oil passes. Such a move would send shockwaves through global markets. While military hardware dominates headlines, the economic stakes may be even more powerful. Iran has between $100 and $120 billion in frozen assets abroad. Nearly $2 billion is frozen in the United States alone. Under a comprehensive deal, Iran would regain access to these funds, resume full oil exports, and reconnect to the global banking system through SWIFT. Over a decade, restored oil revenues could bring $300 billion in economic upside. For Iran, that is transformational. Decades of sanctions have crushed its economy. The rial has collapsed. Protests over economic hardship have shaken the regime. Students demonstrated even on the day of the Geneva talks. For Iran's leadership, this is not just about national pride. It is about survival. Experts disagree sharply on what happens next. Ali Vaez of the International Crisis Group sees cautious optimism. The fact that talks continue suggests enough common ground remains. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh argues that if the White House believed it could easily bomb away Iran's nuclear infrastructure, it likely would have done so already. But Sanam Vakil of Chatham House paints a darker picture. She believes war may be imminent. Trump, she argues, appears to be seeking submission, terms Iran's leadership is not willing to accept. She notes that Iran could agree not to enrich uranium above a certain level, especially since enrichment reportedly halted after last year's strikes. But Iran also wants recognition of its right to limited enrichment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, something the U.S. position may not allow. That is the structural obstacle. Even America's vast military has constraints. The force deployed sends a strong signal, but analysts question whether it is sufficient for a prolonged offensive. There is no ground invasion component. Regime change would require either a popular uprising inside Iran or a sustained air campaign with uncertain consequences. Pentagon leaks suggest munitions shortages could complicate a long campaign. Aircraft carriers require maintenance. Time is not unlimited. A short, sharp strike may degrade facilities, but it likely cannot erase nuclear knowledge or infrastructure permanently. And if even one Iranian missile or drone slips through defenses and causes American casualties, escalation could spiral. A war of choice could become a war of necessity. One of the most dangerous elements in this standoff is uncertainty. What exactly are Washington's red lines? Is the demand no nuclear weapon or no enrichment at all? Trump's State of the Union did not explicitly demand zero enrichment. Officials have hinted that limited medical enrichment might be acceptable. But ambiguity cuts both ways. If Iran does not know what concession is enough, it cannot confidently de-escalate. A miscalculation in this environment could be catastrophic. The region is already exhausted from years of conflict. After the devastating 12-day war with Israel, another confrontation could destabilize the Middle East further. Yet both sides remain locked in a high-stakes gamble. Trump has assembled enormous military power, but has not prepared the American public for a sweeping war. Iran faces economic desperation, but refuses to surrender what it sees as sovereign rights. Diplomats continue to meet. Fighter jets continue to fly. Sanctions continue to tighten. And every move is watched, interpreted, and recalculated. As Nick Payton-Walsh concluded, without a swift deal, Trump's military options are growing slimmer by the week. A short strike may show strength, but could also expose limits. A full war carries enormous risk, and diplomacy requires compromise neither side seems eager to make. For now, the Armada remains in position. The talks continue, and the world waits. Balance between negotiation and confrontation, between pressure and restraint, between uncertainty and decision. Because in this standoff, one miscalculation could reshape the Middle East, and perhaps the world, for a generation. 2 aircraft carriers sit in the Arabian Sea. Technical teams are preparing for talks in Vienna. Oil traders are refreshing their screens. And somewhere between Geneva and Tehran, the fate of a region hangs in the balance. The Iran nuclear crisis has entered its most acute phase since the Israeli strikes of June 2025. And this time, the stakes are not just military, they are economic, political, institutional, global. The world is no longer just watching Washington and Tehran. The world is calculating risk. While diplomats argue and generals posture, global markets are doing something quieter, but just as revealing. They're pricing in uncertainty. Warren Patterson, head of commodities strategy at ING Bank, believes that if the United States launches limited targeted strikes, similar to last summer, and avoids Iran's energy infrastructure, oil prices may spike briefly, but only temporarily, a sharp jump, then stabilization. But if Washington moves toward prolonged military action and Tehran retaliates aggressively, the consequences change dramatically. Oil prices could remain elevated for months. Why? Because Iran sits at the center of global energy routes. Any threat to production, export facilities, or shipping lanes, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, risks choking supply, and the market hates supply shocks. At the same time, traders are closely watching OPEC Plus and its decision on oil output for April. If de-escalation occurs and OPEC Plus resumes supply increases, weaker fundamentals could push oil prices down. In other words, war drives prices up. Diplomacy brings them down, but right now, the market is waiting. Because until the scale of potential U.S. action becomes clearer, no one wants to overreact. Before flying to Geneva, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi framed the negotiations in the most optimistic terms possible. He called it a historic opportunity to reach an unprecedented agreement addressing mutual concerns. But he added a condition. Diplomacy must be given priority. He emphasized that any agreement must be fair, balanced, and equitable. That language is deliberate. Iran does not want to be seen as surrendering. It wants recognition of its sovereignty and its legal right, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to pursue limited enrichment for peaceful purposes. That is where the collision begins. Because the U.S. position, at least publicly, has leaned towards zero enrichment. And those two frameworks are not naturally compatible. Technical talks are scheduled in Vienna next week. That is where nuclear engineers and policy experts will move beyond rhetoric into specifics. Centrifuges, inspection regimes, uranium grades, timelines. Either the gap narrows there, or it becomes undeniable. Amid this tension, one country has emerged as the quiet stabilizer, Oman. Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi has shuttled between capitals, carrying messages and building trust where little exists. His visit to Washington to meet Vice President J.D. Vance signals that Oman's role is not ceremonial. It is essential. In a crisis, this volatile, a neutral channel can mean the difference between escalation and compromise. But even Oman faces a ticking clock. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the only body capable of independently verifying Iran's nuclear status, is preparing for board meetings beginning March 6th. That date matters. President Trump has floated a 10 to 15-day deadline for Iran to produce a detailed proposal. If no substantial progress emerges from the Vienna talks before the IAEA convenes, the diplomatic track could appear exhausted. And when diplomacy appears exhausted, military options suddenly look more attractive to those advocating force. The pressure point is real. Calendar deadlines create momentum, and momentum can lead to irreversible decisions. Despite two Hess carrier groups positioned nearby, Iran's leadership projects calm. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has maintained a defiant tone, suggesting the United States cannot overthrow Iran's government. Foreign Minister Araghchi went even further. He stated that even if Khamenei were killed, Iran's political system would continue, with legal mechanisms in place to appoint a successor. That remark was not casual. It was strategic. It signaled institutional resilience. Tehran wants Washington to understand that regime change is not a quick solution. It would not collapse the system overnight, and that message complicates military calculations in the White House. Inside Trump's inner circle, some advisors reportedly believe kinetic action is more likely than not, but analysts point out several constraints. The current U.S. deployment is large enough to demonstrate intent, but perhaps not large enough for a sustained, weeks-long campaign. There's no ground invasion force assembled. A prolonged air war risks depleting munitions, damaging U.S. credibility if objectives aren't fully achieved, triggering retaliation across American bases in Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, Qatar, and beyond. One missile slipping through defenses and causing Hess casualties could force escalation. A war of choice could transform into a war of obligation. And politically, a drawn-out conflict in the Middle East and without clear victory could become deeply unpopular at home. That is the strategic trap. Short strikes may not eliminate Iran's nuclear knowledge permanently. Long campaigns carry immense risk. Trump's military options are powerful, but narrowing. For Iran, this crisis is not abstract. Sanctions have squeezed its economy for decades. Between $100 and $120 billion in frozen assets remain locked abroad. Oil exports are restricted. The real has collapsed. Protests have shaken the regime, fueled by economic frustration and authoritarian governance. Students were demonstrating even on the day of the Geneva talks. A comprehensive agreement could unlock nearly $300 billion in economic upside over a decade. That kind of relief would not just stabilize the economy, it could transform it. For Iran's leadership, this is not simply about nuclear rights, it is about regime survival. One of the most dangerous features of this crisis is uncertainty over U.S. red lines. Does Washington demand no nuclear weapon, or no enrichment at all? Trump's public statements have varied. Officials have hinted that limited low-level enrichment for medical purposes might be tolerated. But ambiguity, even if strategic, creates risk. If Iran does not know which concession satisfies Washington, it cannot confidently de-escalate. And in high-stakes diplomacy, misunderstanding can be fatal. 2 carrier groups in the Arabian Sea, technical teams heading to Vienna, OPEC Plus weighing oil output decisions, the IAEA preparing its board meeting, Trump floating deadlines, Iran threatening retaliation. And yet, after 6 hours of the most intense talks so far, both delegations agreed to meet again. That matters, because in crises like this, continued dialogue is not guaranteed. The fact that they will sit down again means diplomacy is not dead, but it is under immense strain. The coming weeks will determine the path. If Vienna's technical talks produce a credible framework, the temperature could drop, oil markets could stabilize, sanctions relief discussions could advance. But if the talks fail, if the IAEA meeting passes without progress, if rhetoric hardens further, then Trump's preference for kinetic options may shift from leverage to action. And once action begins, it rarely stays limited. The Iran nuclear crisis has now reached a point where time is a weapon. Each day without agreement increases pressure. Each carrier group increases stakes. Each sanction increases desperation. Yet neither side appears willing to concede its core principles. Iran wants recognition of its nuclear rights and economic relief. The United States wants guarantees that permanently eliminate the risk of an Iranian nuclear weapon. Between those positions lies a narrow bridge. Oman is trying to hold it steady. The IAEA is trying to verify facts. Markets are trying to anticipate outcomes. But ultimately, the decision rests in Washington and Tehran. History often turns not on dramatic declarations, but on small choices made under pressure. Will Washington accept limited enrichment in exchange for verifiable guarantees? Will Tehran trade nuclear ambiguity for economic transformation? Or will miscalculation, pride, and distrust push both sides toward confrontation? For now, the Armada remains. The talks continue. The oil market waits. And the clock is ticking. Because in the coming days, diplomacy and deterrence will collide. And the outcome will shape not only U.S.-Iran relations, but the balance of power in the Middle East, the stability of global energy markets, and the future of nuclear non-proliferation itself. The delegations agreed to meet again. That is something. Whether it is enough is a question neither side, nor the world, can afford to leave unanswered for much longer.